I have been waiting for the signal from the commandant to begin, and now she has given it. Merci, Isabelle. Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon's writers' session, which I know you are going to savor with enormous pleasure. These two women have shaped creative work in new and unusual ways, and they have not only the wickedest sense of humor, but they are two of the fiercest women that I know. I'm going to introduce them each before they read and speak, because I don't want you to confuse them. Not that you would. My name is Aretha Van Herk. You probably know that already, and I want to say that I know how delighted we are all to be here, not only in Oviedo, but at Eaclals, this place where we meet to exchange ideas and to talk about the word, the world, and how to change them both. Anita Badami. Anita Badami appeared in my office at the University of Calgary in 1991. It was March. It was definitely snowing. She was wearing a thin little chiffon sari, and she plunked herself opposite my desk and said, "I have written all these lovely newspaper articles. Can I please do an MA in creative writing?" Her newspaper articles had traveled across the world with her. This is a week after she arrived, and they were tattered and worn. And I looked at her, and I looked at them, and I have no idea what made me say this, because if it had been a young man, I probably would have shown him the door. I said, "Yes, you can do this with me. We will work together." And since that time, we have never looked back. We've become fast friends. She has written 4 novels. She has won dozens of prizes, all of them very well deserved. But my image of Anita is best captured by the fact that you do not want to ever cross her. She lives in Montreal right now. She left Calgary for Montreal. I can't imagine why. And one day, she went out into her yard, and there was a robber in the garden with a gun. I'm not kidding. She chased him out of her garden, and she chased him down the street, and he ran. Anita did not have a gun. I want you to know that this is a formidable woman, a formidable writer, and a wonderful word person. So welcome, Anita Badami.
Thank you, Aretha. I don't know about the formidable bit. Foolish would probably describe me better for chasing after a bloke with a gun. But still, I chased him. He ran, never came back. And then after that, I burst into tears and said, "What was I doing?" Anyways, that incident is making it into my next book, my 5th novel. It's actually the central idea in that book. And I think part of that ferocity and the willingness to plunge into unexpected situations without thinking and just with your fingers crossed comes from having been a city person my entire life. I lived in India till I was 29. I was born in India, lived there till I was 29. And most of my life in India was spent in cities, in large urban centers and small urban centers too, because the definition of a city in India is completely different, or at least it seemed completely different for me when I moved from India to Canada. In India, you have towns which are like cities in many parts of the world. Then you have small cities, which is where I lived, and then you have these mega cities where I also lived. And living in those cities teaches you an enormous amount about life and living and how to live and how to take care of yourself, and how to recognize how to live with fear, but also a kind of comfort and also a sense of absurdity. In an Indian city, you simply cannot exist unless you possess a really healthy sense of humor or a healthy sense of the absurd. And you learn how to negotiate life in a city, in an Indian city at any rate, with that sense of something really, really, I mean, everything has to be funny, otherwise you're just going to be crushed by it. It's full of unexpected moments. It is a place where you can be completely alone, while at the same time you're part of a crowd. You're anonymous as well as with a specific identity. And in a city, for me at least, the identity is born out of the street on which you live, or the neighborhood, or the people in your apartment building. And this is a little segue away from the main idea here. The Indian cities in which I lived, I actually lived to see them transformed. The landscape itself was transformed. A city like Bangalore, for instance, which I used to visit ever since I was a child, because my grandparents lived there, was a city which people called a village-like city, a holiday city, simply because it was so low-rise. There weren't any multi-storied buildings in a city in Bangalore when I was a child, and this was, in the 70s. There were independent homes. Those homes housed multi-families, the same family, but many units. So there would be, many generations, grandparents, great-grandparents, all living in one house, what they called a joint family. But I've seen that city transformed because of the IT boom. It's now the Silicon Valley of India, and now all those beautiful tree-lined roads have vanished. It's become a city of concrete. There are multiple, enormous skyscrapers everywhere. And now there are cities within the city, because as the city has exploded beyond its boundaries, people want to go back to that old private way of life, and so they gate themselves inside these communities. So you have 100 skyscrapers inside this walled, gated community. You don't have to get out of that. This is within a city, so it's little townships or cities within cities. So now your identity is not just your street, it's not just your little neighborhood, it's your gated community. And once in the cities of my past, the street might have been people of the same economic class, except for the sidewalks where life was lived as well. There was a separate kind of life going on the sidewalks, and it's still that way in India. There aren't any boundaries. You have cities lived within homes, but you also have cities where people lead their lives out on sidewalks, little shanty towns that just come up, automatically. Somebody finds a piece of plastic, someone needs a home, and they set up a home for themselves on the sidewalk. That's life in a city in India. Everybody on your street used to recognize you, but nobody really knew you. And that, to some extent, is still true in the cities that I visit when I go back to India now. In a city, you grew up feeling the comfort of always being in a crowd, but you were also worried about the degeneration of that same crowd into smaller modules of anger or hate or celebration. You're friendly in a city, but deep within you carry a core of hard suspicion. I remember my mother, whenever we went out of I should actually introduce my own life was, like I said, was lived in. Did I say that at all? I grew up as the daughter of a railway officer, and my life was lived in one of those gated, walled colonies. So even though we lived in a city, I wasn't really off the city until I left those gates to go to school or go with my parents to the market, and then suddenly the city would come at me. There was this flood of information, of people, of lives, of stories, of all kinds of theatrical happenings every moment, all the way from our gates out to wherever it was I was going. On the sidewalk, for instance, I remember there was this woman in Calcutta who lived in some kind of tin construction, and which she had made out of cans of cooking oil. So there's always this greasy smell, and she couldn't cook inside because her whole home would start smoking. And she was a spectacle, and she claimed to be the deposed queen of some little princely state. And she was living there in protest against the government, which had seized all her property and everything she had. And all that she was left with was 6 greyhounds, 6 dogs. This was her empire now on the sidewalk. Everybody called her the queen. We used to call her Rani Ma, because she said that she was a queen. So there were all these incidents. I remember seeing death on a daily basis. Traffic accidents were a constant occurrence. So death was something that was familiar to me from the time I was a little child. I was used to seeing dead bodies. I mean, funeral processions used to occur on the road. People would be carrying corpses decorated with flowers on their way to the funeral parlor. I remember once in Delhi, I was trying to cross a road, and there were these 2 young men standing there trying to cross along with me, and it was impossible to cross because the signs weren't working, the road lights weren't working, and there was this endless stream of cars and buses, and we were just stranded there waiting, with the 3 of us and this dead body. And I started talking to one of the men. One of them was shorter, the other one was taller, so the body was at a slant, and she was sort of tied up to these 2 planks of wood, decorated with flowers. And it turned out that the person on that bier was the mother of these 2 young men. I ended up holding one end of one of the biers because the younger boy was getting really tired from holding up this thing while we were waiting to cross. So these are moments in cities in India as I experience them. The colony life was a safe life. We always had water, there was always protection, nothing was going to explode and turn into something else without any notice. But the minute we went outside, my mother was always, she was always wary. We were like a bunch of insects with our antennae quivering in expectation of something. Anything was likely to happen when you were out in the city. We'd see a gathering of people, and we'd immediately begin to assess whether they were celebrating or whether they were protesting, whether they were going to start beating up each other, or whether we were going to be swept along with this stream of joyous cries and music and happiness. So this is probably why I reacted to this fellow in my backyard the way I did, because that's how I lived in a city. And it also explains why all my fictions are set in urban landscapes. My knowledge of life comes from these crowded worlds built out of concrete human lives and their stories. They're exciting, shifting places, a never-ending drama unfolding in this corner or that, every moment, every day. They're centers of flow, transnational, of people, capital, ideas, news, cultures. Change is the single constant in a city, just as it has been in my life. Because my father was an engineer in the railways, we moved every 3 years. Yet, although we were in these busy urban centers, like I said, because we lived in these railway colonies, we experienced the city at a remove in a strange sort of way until we moved out of those colonies altogether, and then the city became my life. In an Indian city, and this is something I never realized until I moved to Canada, and my first stop was Calgary. And when I arrived there, I remember somebody asking me whether I was suffering from culture shock. And I remember thinking, what does he mean? What does he mean, culture shock? It wasn't culture shock that I was suffering from. It was the shock of the weather. It was the shock of silence. And I remember thinking, and I remember that my idea of a city shifted so utterly in that moment. From these crazy cities I'd grown up in where there were no boundaries, because, like I said, life was lived on the sidewalks. Lives that are, that ordinarily in India are demarcated on the basis of caste, religious groups, etc. The lives that are led in villages, there are those clear demarcations. In the city, in an Indian city, there aren't any lines, there aren't any borders. Everything is porous. You just shift from one to the other. You might form these little ghettos, but there is absolutely no opportunity for the maintenance of those lines, except when these crowds boil over and there's something happening and they explode, and then all those factors come into play. But in this Canadian city where I landed up, in Calgary, there was none of that. This was a city, but it was such an orderly city. Lights worked, you could cross roads. Nobody lived on sidewalks. My whole idea of what a city should be or was or is changed dramatically. And of course, there weren't that many people. I remember I'd go for a walk and find myself terrified by the sound of my own footsteps. I'd keep looking over my shoulder to see who was following me. It was just my own footsteps. And I remember thinking, if I was in some kind of trouble, there's nobody here. Who do I shout for? There were streams of cars. There were homes, but I never ever saw anybody in those homes. And then afterwards, I discovered that most of the summer people live in their backyards, and that's behind there, not facing the road. The only time that I felt that I was in a real city was when I came to, from Calgary, I moved to Vancouver, which was also, it's a city, but it was also so pleasant and ordered, and, people could cycle where they were meant to cycle and not get run over by cars and cows and all kinds of other things. The only time I've felt the only city in Canada, at least thus far, that feels like an Indian city is actually Montreal. There are so many potholes, there's so much of corruption, there's dog shit all over the place when the snow melts. So I feel quite at home there, I must admit. Nobody has erected any structures on my sidewalk to date. The only things that happen on those sidewalks are garage sales in the spring. But otherwise, you might drive under a bridge and a part of the bridge might just fall on your head, and that's all par for the course. It feels exactly like an Indian city. So that's where the writing comes from. And I also wanted to talk about the invention of a city that I've done. I invented an entire city for the Hero's Walk. I suppose you'd call it a small city rather than a big Indian city. It's a city called Toturpuram. And I invented it by stealing fragments from a larger city called Madras or Chennai. There was one particular street which I stole from quite heavily. It's a street I've never lived in Chennai. But it's one that that has always fascinated me, because it's one of those streets where only one particular caste lives. And I have grown up, the life I had, maybe because it was my parents, or maybe because it was the fact that I lived in these railway colonies where, caste means nothing, religion means nothing. In a railway colony, people from all walks of life sign up to work for the Indian Railways. You play with children from every caste, culture, class, everything. But within the city of Madras, for instance, there's this one street which I call Brahmin Street in my book, and I suppose it could be called Brahmin Street in Chennai itself. It's one single caste. It's one long street leading from a large temple, and the temple owns that entire street and all the houses in it. And people who live there lease those homes from the temple and have done so. The same family sometimes has leased the same house for nearly 200 to 300 years. And the road leads straight to the beach. Now that road itself has seen a huge amount of change over the years. It's no longer a place where only the Brahmin castes live. The temple has been selling its property, and there are people who belong to what they call the lower castes who've become very wealthy businessmen who bought all that property, and that leads to a lot of strife on that particular street. But I've always been fascinated by that street. I've visited it a few times, been inside some of those houses, and I decided to make that whole street the town or the city of Thothurpuram, which is where this book, The Hero's Walk, is set. And before I run out of time and before Anita starts glowering at me, I shall read a passage from this book. The main character is a 57-year-old man named Sripati Rao. He works as an advertising copywriter in a really small advertising agency in Thothurpuram. Now, this agency is based on a place called Parade, which is where I worked when I started my career as, I worked in all kinds of writing jobs. I was a copywriter for about a year, couldn't stand having to sit in an office and write jingles about lipsticks and things, and then ended up becoming a freelance journalist. So Sripati Rao is headed out on the streets of his city on an errand. And this is a scene from the life of Thothurpuram, and it can be construed to be the life in almost any city I've lived in India. When he emerged into the late afternoon heat, the rush hour had started. Shoals of school children in limp uniforms with loaded backpacks or satchels waited at bus stops. There were mommies with heavy silk saris in rich magentas, emeralds and purples on their way to the temple, the market, or to their music groups, and young college girls in crushed cotton saris or salwar kameez suits. Sripati whipped past Iyengar Bakery on his scooter, its familiar blue and green lettering partially masked by sheets of plastic. It looked like Iyengar had finally yielded to market pressures, exerted by the sudden proliferation of bakeries in the area, serving exotic things like pizza buns and donuts, and was doing up his tiny shop. He had even inserted advertisements in the paper, Sripati had noticed. A horn blasted insistently behind him. Sripati peered into his mirror and saw a bus hot on his heels. It had a complicated license number on its head, a series of letters followed by an illegible route number. The letters were the initials of the current chief minister of the state. An astrologer had said they were so powerfully good that they would ward off all accidents. But since the chief minister had several initials to her name, there was barely room for anything else. As a result, the number was sometimes omitted altogether or else painted on the side of the bus. The fact that nobody ever knew where they were going when they got into a bus became a regular excuse for lateness at offices around the town. "Why are you late again today, Raman?" "Very sorry, sir. Got into the wrong bus and it went off to the railway station, sir. Conductor himself did not know where the bus was going or what number it was." It was true that not one bus had toppled over or crashed for some time. However, they were directly responsible for numerous other mishaps on the road and on pavements where many a driver steered his vehicle when the road was too crowded for him to move as fast as he wanted, crushing vendors with their carts loaded with bananas, or a street astrologer who had neglected to foresee his own future, or a beggar who might have died in her sleep. But then the chief minister's initials were supposed to protect only the bus and its occupants, not every single person and dog and cow on the streets of Thoturpuram. Sripati increased speed to get away from the bus, but the horn blasts followed close on his heels. He glanced over his shoulder and caught sight of the driver grinning devilishly at him. Playing games, the stupid bastard. Sripati edged into another lane and let the bus speed past. No use tangling with those bus buggers. They all thought themselves heroes, demigods immune to disaster. Ever since a local bus conductor had become a film star, the entire transport service had started acting smart, driving their buses like pumped-up cowboys, as if roads were racetracks. "Yay, sir, you want to die or what?" screamed an auto rickshaw fellow, puttering close to Sripati's scooter. In his anxiety to get away from the bus, Sripati had veered into the path of the three-wheeler. He moved away and the auto took off, buzzing in and out of gaps in the frantic afternoon traffic like a crazy beetle. In the back of the tiny vehicle, with its doorless openings on either side, the passengers, a pair of young women, held on to the canvas walls grimly. The movement of the auto turning their faces into vibrating jelly. One of them let go for a moment to grab a wing of her sari that was taking flight from the auto and, struggling to tuck it between her legs, nearly fell out. In between lanes, at the site of some repair work temporarily abandoned by the municipality for lack of funds or inclination to work, a beggar had constructed a house with gunny sacks, sewer covers stolen from around the city, empty boxes that had once contained television sets, and even a pilfered signboard that said, "Private property, beware of dog." The last bit of the message had been scratched out and replaced with Mr. S.S. Ishwaran, M.A. History, University of Kupparigunda. Mr. Ishwaran himself stood outside his home, a small man with a disdainful expression on his face, as if he had nothing to do with the shack behind him. Now and again, he lost his aloofness and screamed spectacular abuse at one of several naked children playing calmly in the middle of all the traffic, dashing after marbles among the churning wheels. On the ground near his feet lay a large stainless steel bowl holding a few rupee coins. Inside the precarious shack squatted a hollow-cheeked woman, blowing softly at a coal fire, trying to coax it to life. Sripati passed the man every day on his way to work and wondered whether he really had a master's degree in history. If he did, look at where that degree had brought him. But such was life. Like those numberless buses, you never knew what you were getting into or where you were headed until the very end, and then it was too late to get off. There was a momentary lull at the traffic lights when hundreds of vehicles came to a stop and waited, chugging and revving and roaring like impatient beasts. The policeman had taken advantage of the fact that the lights were working for a change and had abandoned his elevated chowki in the mid-center of the intersection in favor of a quick break at the nearby coffee shop. An emaciated woman had taken his place, her scrawny body draped in a ragged sari that fluttered wispily in the thin breeze, sometimes exposing a long, dry breast, an underarm, or a thigh as weathered as a piece of driftwood. She swayed and jerked like an animated scarecrow high above the traffic. "She's mad," said a man on the scooter next to Sripati's. "There are rumors that that policeman raped her daughter." The man had one child crouching between his feet on the front of the scooter and two more stacked like dishes on the pillion behind him. Some urchins started to dance below the police chowki, crowing derisively up at the woman. "Hoochie, hoochie, head full of hay seeds," they called. The woman continued to sway, her body following the sad, disordered loops of her mind. A policeman emerged from the tea stall, his shirt gleaming white, his khaki trousers tight as drum skin against his crotch. He tapped his baton against the palm of his hand as he strolled through the pulsing traffic. He had an enormous mustache and a white Stetson hat. Until recently, traffic policemen wore turbans, but the latest chief minister had a passion for Hollywood westerns that she indulged by insisting on a change of uniform for the entire police force. She would have liked to replace the official jeeps with horses, but the municipal commissioner had objected. "As it is, we spend our time cleaning cow dung and human dung from the roads of the town. Now we will have to pick up horse shit too," he was reported to have said. Too much, this nonsense. We will organize a sweeper strike and then we will see about horses." "Look, she's directing traffic while you drink coffee, sir," shouted one of the urchins, dancing nimbly out of the way before the policeman could land a slap on his head. The man set his hat at a more dignified angle, wrapped the baton against his thigh, and glared up at the woman. "You there, get down," he ordered. The woman stopped swaying and gazed emptily down at him. "Now itself, get down, I say." The baton pointed imperiously at the ground. "Down, down, down," caroled the woman, and in one fluid movement, she lifted her rags and thrust a scraggy pubic patch at the policeman. "Papa, I saw her shame, puppy shame," giggled the child on the scooter next to Sripati. His father thumped him on the back and shoved his head down frantically with one hand, at the same time trying to shield the two little girls behind him by leaning sideways. The scooter teetered unsteadily, and all the children screamed. "What is this country coming to?" he remarked, smiling apologetically at Sripati as if he were responsible for the whole absurd show. The lights changed, and the traffic streamed forward, leaving the woman leaping around in the tight circle of the police chowki, butting her skeletal bottom out at the world. Thank you.
Adventure, you see. Our next reader is Simone Lazaru. Simone, as well, is a writer of considerable renown and has published a number of books. I know her because we had a wonderful odyssey through the streets of an unnamed Spanish city in search of what we could not name but needed to find, which was underwear, because my luggage had not appeared in a former excursion. So we would go into every lovely lingerie shop and try to describe that we wanted underwear. Well, I wanted it. She was merely, aiding and abetting me. And finally, after many, many lingerie shops and frustrated people, we found out that the name for underwear, and you must understand, of course, that I have written a novel about an underwear saleswoman. So this is very important, was bragas. So Simone and I have a great experience of walking down the street, singing at the top of our lungs, bragas, bragas, bragas. And she too is an incorrigible woman. So please join me in welcoming Simone Lazaru from Australia.
Thanks, Aretha. Thanks, everyone. This is going to be a bit like calling a race because I originally planned it for 1 hour, so I've cut it down, but I'll go as fast as I can and try and remain at least understandable. All my novels and short fiction explore in some way individuals living at the juncture of cultures, and this is no doubt partly due to my bicultural, or dare I say, multicultural parentage. I have an Anglo-Australian mother, that's an oversimplification, and a Eurasian father, an even bigger oversimplification. While all cultural identities are complex, Eurasianness is surely an exemplar par excellence of this complexity. I'm currently working on a 3-part novel that explores aspects of these and other complexities in 3 contemporary cities: Singapore, Perth in Western Australia, and Lisbon. It's titled, the novel in progress is titled Bodies of Water, and the title alludes to the bodies and minds of individuals, always in flux. The title Bodies of Water also alludes to the rivers, oceans, and other reservoirs of water and history that connect and separate those individuals. So I'm going to read from part 1 and the prologue of Bodies of Water first. Part 1, titled Endlessness, and a few of you have heard a much earlier version of this before. The extracts from Endlessness, from which I'll read today, are based, or were based initially on research into familial anecdote and photo albums. I also relied a fair bit on textual and pictorial histories and old maps for many details, as well as personal observations made during visits to my birthplace, Singapore. I don't have time to speak in much more detail about that research now. Suffice to say that my literary representations of urban scenes involve researching and representing not only physical spaces and the appearances, behaviour, thoughts and emotions of individuals dwelling in them, but also how socio-economic circumstances and historical and cultural traces manifest themselves in those individuals and those spaces. The extracts I'm reading today will hopefully show aspects of this. So I'll begin with the prologue of Bodies of Water, followed by extracts from Endlessness. In Endlessness, Eva Oliveira is a childless midwife who migrated as a young child with her Eurasian father and English mother from Singapore to Australia in the late 1960s. And in this, Eva attempts to piece together her divorced parents' lives as she visits her dying father in a Perth nursing home around about 2010. I'll then conclude with a few paragraphs from Bodies of Water's second part, which is titled at this stage The Archaeologist's Secret Lisbon still in its very early draft stages. So, to the prologue of the novel now. They'd met by chance in the Market of Thieves on her first day in Lisbon, but it felt more like destiny, they agreed later, when they both had filthy hands and troubled consciences. The scraps of treasure scrounged from the city's broken history and the nearby shorelines of vanished empires, the ransacking of their own crumbling defences, just holidaying in his country, hoping to leave her recent griefs and illness behind, she hadn't anticipated a city of even greater loss. Tell me, the middle-aged Portuguese man selling old bones, broken statues, and indecipherable fragments had asked Eva at that first meeting, where do you come from and where are you going? Endlessness. Family assorted biscuits. Born on a red tide in Singapore's Water Buffalo Maternity Hospital, Evangelia Oliveira had been told by her mother during childhood that her Christian name meant bringer of good news, and she'd been told by her father that it meant she knows. It was one of many things her parents had disagreed on after they migrated to Australia. They hadn't ever commented on the surname, except to say it came from an ancestor who'd sailed to Malacca during the Portuguese age of expansion centuries before. All those ethnic genes swimming around in her gene pool, the only child of Eurasian Francis Xavier Oliveira and Australian Elspeth Maureen Gray, Evangelia had insisted on shortening her name to Eva to make it sound less foreign. We should have called you Big Mouth La, her father teased when he filled in their Australian citizenship certificate application form, because you eat and talk too much. Eva found good news hard to come by in their new neighbourhood and didn't feel she knew enough about its inhabitants, who kept to themselves in their large suburban houses on barren quarter-acre blocks. She'd started her habits of spying and eating too much back then. Refusing her parents' curries, she'd snacked daily on Arnott's family assorted biscuits dunked in sweet cups of Bushells tea, her own age of expansion, all that new Australian food, all that emptiness to fill. Francis Xavier Oliveira was the second child of Rosa Mary the Saint and Rodrigo Valor Oliveira, a Eurasian customs officer who'd been jailed by the Japanese in Changi during the war for allegedly aiding the British colonial government to blow up Singapore's harbour so the invaders couldn't use it. Francis's father never spoke about what he'd seen in prison, but his screams of terror during his nightmares woke the family for years after the war finished. Francis hadn't aspired to saintliness as his mother had hoped when she named him, but he had become swimming champion of his Catholic boys' school in Singapore after taking up the sport to build his muscles after wartime malnutrition. During those years, he'd developed an interest in pools, reservoirs, and other bodies of water as he looked for places to train. Covering his thinness and uncertainty with his recently deceased father's suit jacket, Francis, the 20-year-old engineering student, stood in the dirt amongst the kampong chickens and goats with the other Colombo-planned scholarship students about to travel to Australia to further their studies. A British engineer briefed them about the recently unfurled blueprints for an intricate system of plumbing and housing in Singapore. The engineer held the crisp plans high in the air so the goats couldn't eat them and assured the students and kampong dwellers that the new pipelines would deliver unprecedented convenience and release them from centuries of filth and disease. Fresh off the ship from Singapore, Francis Oliveira met Maureen Green on his first morning at the university student boarding house in Perth. It was 1959, and the boarding house hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and milk, with not even the faintest whiff of spice. Maureen's room was just across the hall from Francis's. Despite this proximity, it seemed at first they were latitudes apart. Sitting on the banks of the Swan River opposite the university was a novelty to them both. Such a wide river, Frances marvelled. Where does it go? The Indian Ocean. We should swim in it, La. Too deep. I've never really learned to swim, Maureen confessed, but I'm good at floating and treading water. Francis Oliveira's parents had died a few months before he'd met Maureen, partly from the invisible, long-running wounds of the horrors they'd seen wrought by the Japanese invaders, fellow prisoners being tortured, neighbours' heads impaled on fence railings, young women from their church forced into prostitution in the Japanese soldiers' comfort houses. Francis hadn't told Maureen that his father's wartime experiences had led to complications arising from alcoholism being written on his death certificate. Francis kept such family secrets underground and never suspected Maureen harboured her own post-war family secrets, for he thought the war had never touched Perth. Francis returned to Singapore qualified as a water supply and waste disposal engineer. On his first day working for the government, he was handed a spade, a pair of rubber boots, a plan of the proposed sewage disposal system for a cramped kampong near the CBD, and a white cotton handkerchief to tie over his nose and mouth as he dug. His new job called for tunnel vision heroism. The soil around the kampong was clay, and people still emptied their waste into open drains on the street. No maps could help Francis locate these outpourings. He ducked an upturned bucketful here, an ammoniac-smelling puddle there. One morning, he surfaced from a newly dug tunnel into a tiny room full of 10 Chinese labourers sleeping the day shift on straw mats. The closest man woke afraid and hit the young engineer, causing his palm to slip against the spade handle. The government sent me, Francis explained, to help lay the new pipes. They'll help prevent disease. But neither of them spoke one another's language. Francis retreated through the tunnel he'd just dug. The cut on his dirt-stained hand was shaped like the white crescent on Malaya's recently unfurled flag, symbolising a new moon and nation, but it was the blood red of mortality. Had disease already entered his body? Afraid of contacting tetanus, cholera, hepatitis, and other undiagnosable diseases, he doused the crescent-shaped scar in Jay's disinfectant and went to the government clinic for every available inoculation. That night he dreamed of Perth, where Maureen Green and an efficient sewage disposal system were already in place and tropical diseases were almost unheard of. He wrote a letter inviting Maureen to visit, and the paper was lightly smeared with blood from his wound. When Maureen arrived a month later, Francis wasn't at Singapore Harbour to greet her, despite her detailed telegram to him giving her ship's arrival time. After a bewildering hour on the dock waiting for him, she'd burst into tears. "So you didn't really want her even then?" Eva asked him as he sat in his nursing home bed. He shrugged and claimed that he'd simply overlooked her arrival time because he'd taken his Phoenix brand Chinese watch off that day so it wouldn't get dirty as he dug tunnels. The watch had fallen into one of the old sewers he was helping to replace. He'd watched it sink below the viscous grey surface and remembered Maureen was about to arrive, and he sensed that time would never have the same meaning for him again. Whenever she visited him in the nursing home decades later and listened to his life story, Eva's father didn't tell her about the passion between him and her mother when they were courting. But Eva's mother had told her once how the stilts of his late parents' house, Generosa, had swayed when they made love, making the teak shutters of his bedroom swing open to reveal the rapturous garden, the blooming rose bushes planted by British expatriates before the war, the orchard of rambutan, lychee, citrus and mango trees. Through their branches she'd glimpsed the reservoir's dazzling reflections of jungle-fringed sunsets and sunrises, when vividly plumed birds sang loudest. The house was built for a British rubber plantation owner before the war. After the war ended, he didn't return. Rodrigo and Rosa bought the house for a song, named it Generosa, and added an outdoor kitchen for cooking satay and all the other smoky food on a wood stove. Asian and European civilizations met in Generosa and its orchard. Everything nourishing grew there, she'd told Eva. As he ate too many biscuits for afternoon tea in the nursing home, her father told Eva that he'd watched government job opportunities for Singapore's Eurasian minority receding in the wake of the expatriates returning home to Britain. Around that time, Maureen's father, George Green, had written to say Perth needed water supply engineers. For a few months, it looked as if Frances's dark skin colour would be incompatible with the white Australia policy. But George, a senior public servant, had pulled a few mysterious strings that moved a rubber stamp somewhere in the Immigration Department's Perth office. When the immigration papers came through, Maureen packed their clothes in 3 Great Wall brand suitcases and stuffed her wedding dress and veil into a tea chest with the family photos and Generosa's old saucepans, and they'd sailed with Eva on a P&O liner into the Indian Ocean. On the Olivera's first Anzac Day in Perth, they'd reclined in deck chairs on her grandparents' carefully mown lawn between the Eureka lemon tree and the blue tinted bird bath, eating scones, drinking Schweppes lemonade and Swan Lager shandies. Grandpa and Grandma Green had silver hair and pale wrinkled skin, unlike any Eva had seen before, and traces of their English upbringings in their voices. Grandpa came from a long line of English dairy farmers. Grandma Green sat up stiffly under her new perm and said, "Here comes Arthur, my brother." Why had Maureen's grip on Eva's hand tightened as the balding war hero approached, baring his nicotine-stained teeth? "He fought in Singapore," Grandma Green said proudly to Frances. "Say hello to Uncle Arthur, Eva." Eva had refused, burying her face in Maureen's lap. "Did the Japs send you to Changi?" Frances had asked Arthur affably. "I got out of Singapore in the nick of time," Uncle Arthur replied. As he bent over Eva, she smelled the tobacco and beer breath. "Funny you should have a daughter like her," he leered at Maureen. "Quite pretty, considering. She'll grow up to look like one of those Asian nightclub hostesses." The war medals on his flabby chest swung in Eva's face. As her father chewed another biscuit and dropped crumbs on the floor of his nursing home room, Eva recalled her father expressing sadness about leaving Singapore behind only once in her childhood. "Saudade," he said to her mother one day after telling her that a policeman had gone through his pockets at the local supermarket and called him a thieving bung. "What's saudade mean?" Eva had asked. "Daddy's missing Singapore," her mother said. "It's an old Portuguese Eurasian word his family sometimes used." "It's more than missing Singapore, La. It's deep longing for home," he said. "But this is home, Dad, isn't it?" "So why did you leave Mum?" Eva asked her father as his slippered feet ground the biscuit crumbs into the nursing home carpet. Yeah, can't remember exactly. She carried on endlessly," he said. "What do you mean?" "All that crying, poor thing." In the pause, his second wife, Trudy, bustled into his nursing home room. "I was just about to leave," lied Eva, kissing him and backing into the corridor. "I'll see you out," Trudy said. She flicked her frosted fringe as they walked to the main entrance. "I've started clearing his stuff out of our unit. Got some in my car for you." An ex-Qantas hostess, Trudy had low tolerance for excess belongings and inefficiency. She'd put just a few mementos of Francis Xavier's Singaporean life in the box with his discarded spectacles and Kmart clothes. A post-war photo of him and his father wearing chino trousers and white shirts. his sister Mercedes and a friend in their new look dresses, and their mother wearing a version of her kebaya over a frock. There was also a photo of an infant sitting on some scales, the Rolex watch the Singaporean government had given Francis in acknowledgement of his work on the new pipelines, and a 1957 Singapore street directory with his handwriting on several maps. Her father told her next time she visited the nursing home that he'd been hallucinating. What kind of hallucinations? Being arrested by police for not having a passport, being locked up to freeze to death in cold storage. Where? Singapore or Australia, never sure which one. 2 slow tears ran down his face. I miss everything in Singapore. Saudade. He wiped his tears, brightened slightly. Auntie Mercedes visited me today. Eva didn't have the heart to remind him that his sister Mercedes had died in Singapore a few months ago and never made it across the Indian Ocean to visit him. His memory, too, had been slurred by the disease. Only episodes from his more distant past seemed clear to him. Please, Eva, he said, I would like some photos of where I came from, the church, Generosa's orchard. Can you go to Singapore and take them for me and bring me some Jay's disinfectant? The disease is everywhere. Would you like your Rolex so you know the time? Eva asked him, putting it on his bedside table. It's still working. It'll work forever, he said. And Trudy gave me your Singapore street directory. Show me all the places that were important to you and Mum. Sitting in his vinyl nursing home armchair, her father peered at the map where he'd written reservoir many years before. Lee Kuan Yew's government bulldozed the old house for a shopping mall, but the orchard should still be there, It was so close to the city reservoir they wouldn't touch it. Please bring me back photos to ease the saudade. She booked herself a bargain Singapore Airlines fare and hotel online. When she waved her father goodbye at the nursing home before she flew to take photos of places important to him, he held out both his hands towards her. She heard the ticking of his watch. She saw the crescent-shaped scar on his palm, the inoculation marks on his upper arm. His trembling hands might have been giving her his blessing. They might have been begging her to take him with her. They might have been bidding her farewell. They might have been trembling with all the maladies he'd endured. Asian, Australian, and maybe the one he'd called Saudade. Looking down from her window seat as the plane glided over the cloud-silvered sea towards Changi Airport, Eva recalled her father telling her during childhood that the airport had been built over the foundations of the jail where her grandfather had been imprisoned by the Japanese during the war, that bodies still lay under the runways, though their souls had ascended long before Changi's first planes had. The Chinese immigration official looked suspiciously at her when she handed him her Australian passport. Are you bringing in any illegal drugs, alcohol, pornographic magazines? No. Give me your jacket. He squeezed her jacket's padded shoulders, turned it inside out, grabbed a pair of scissors and cut into the shoulder pads and felt inside. He handed the jacket back, stamped her passport and muttered, "Have a pleasant stay." Her hotel looked as if it had been built in the 1960s or 70s, its stuccoed exterior walls mildewed where the air conditioning units leaked. She'd chosen it because its tariff was cheaper than any nearby, and it was close to where Generosa had once stood. Under her room door, she found a business card offering hot massage from Busty May. Standing on the concrete balcony, she saw a reservoir, but a 10-storey apartment block and 3-storey shopping centre had been built where she guessed the house and orchard had probably stood. She wandered down to the concrete void deck of the apartment block. There, offerings of incense and cracker biscuits had been left at a makeshift altar, draped in gold calligraphy on red paper. She went up one flight of steps. Just along from the stairwell, she saw a middle-aged Chinese woman leaving buckets of water outside the door of one of the apartments. Why are you doing that? The father of the family inside left a few months ago, cannot afford to pay their water bills, so they've had it cut off. Our whole kampong had only one tap to share when I was a girl, but water cost us nothing before all these apartments were built by the government. The woman went back to her apartment and shut the door. The shiny white corridors seemed so claustrophobic and bleak that Eva went outside again to look for traces of the orchard, but there were none. She wandered through the gleaming white shopping centre. Copy watches, mobile phones, vinyl accessories and clothes from China. She bought herself pork dumplings and a can of chrysanthemum tea from the food stall next to the McDonald's that sold hamburgers with satay sauce. She carried her lunch across the car park towards a bench seat overlooking the reservoir. As she ate, her mobile phone rang. Your dad's got pneumonia, love. They've given up on the antibiotics. He's falling in and out of consciousness, said Trudy, her voice clear despite the distance. Won't be long now. She sounded almost relieved. I'll read it now from an extract immediately after Eva's returned to Perth. Francis's eyes were closed when they entered his room, his head sinking into his pillow. Had they arrived too late to have one last conversation with him? Dad, she said softly, I've brought Mum to see you. Francis opened his eyes swiftly, looked straight at at Maureen, reached out his thin, trembling hand. I've been waiting years for the dam to break, he rasped. Evie, can you stop that bloody watch ticking? Maureen sat in the vinyl chair, stroking his hand. How's the garden, Maureen? Still growing, Maureen looked him steadily in the eye. Give us some time alone together, Evie. Evie backed through the doorway with his Rolex into the corridor, but she couldn't help eavesdropping. Francis, Maureen confided. His eyes widened with the effort of acknowledging her. I am sorry, I was never any good at it. Eva closed her eyes. Surely her mother wasn't talking about swimming now. Her mother lowered her voice. Something terrible happened to me when I was a child, you see, which caused me pain when we made love. Uncle, she glanced up, saw Eva listening, stopped talking. In the warm corridor, Eva backed away, shivering. She closed her eyes but couldn't shut out the war medals swinging from Uncle Arthur's flabby chest against her face. Her mother murmured something she couldn't hear. Why didn't you tell me all those years ago? Francis rasped. I thought you wouldn't want me if you knew. Their murmuring stopped. Eva peered through the doorway again. In the twilight, their gaunt old faces were only just visible, but she sensed Francis, Xavier, Oliviera, and Maureen Elspeth Green were sharing more hope and love than they ever had when they were married. Through the window behind them, she glimpsed the Indian Ocean, saw how histories kept merging despite apparently coming to an end. So much we haven't told each other, her father finally said. How many of our stories stay untold because we're ashamed of them? Maureen replied. We had a beautiful child though, didn't we? She said, just loud enough for Eva to hear. Francis nodded proudly. And clever, swam like a champion, even in your belly. Birth weight, 11 pounds. What a monster. The meeting of two civilisations from which good things grow, said Elspeth. How long will you stay with me? He asked. How long do you want me to stay? Endlessly, he said, closing his eyes, gripping her hand more tightly and floating through the twilight with her into the deep. So that's the end of Endlessness, part one of my novel in progress, and I'll conclude just with a few very brief paragraphs from part two, titled The Archaeologist's Secret Lisbon, still in its very early draft stages. Research for the historical layers and contemporary interactions between poverty-stricken locals and wealthier travellers in tourist destinations for the archaeologist's Secret Lisbon has included walking some of those districts with maps, camera and notebook, and most importantly, with Lisbon locals with historical and archaeological knowledge about sites and antiquities markets, including the black market. And as this Alfama district map shows, I sometimes scribble notes on maps as I go, noting details about sites and current streetscapes, sometimes translations of street names that are often loaded with history and humour too. So I'm going to read now from a section where the archaeologist takes Eva to one of his favourite places in Lisbon. So we have, his name is Manuel. Is that Fado museum next door worth visiting? Eva asked. I have no money to go there, he shrugged. Depend if you like Fado music. Do you? Not the shit the restaurants around here play for the tourists. When the waitress placed the coffees and a verdigreed key on a tray, he carried it towards a small wooden door under the stairs. Help me, Eva. Take the key and open the door for me. The door unlocked easily enough, but opened onto steep stone stairs leading down to blackness, smelling and echoing like a cave, water dripping into water. It looks dangerous. You only say that when you can't see anything. He flicked a switch inside the door. A bare globe flickered over the stairs before illuminating a high-arched stone gallery reflected in a long rectangular pool. He closed the door behind them, descended the stairs and led her along the path until they reached a stone column. Behind it, an old wooden bench on a platform. Please, Eva, he said, bowing low, placing the coffee tray in the middle of the bench. They sat with the tray between them, peering into the dimness beyond. A low, mournful voice rose suddenly from the backmost recesses of the reservoir. What's that? Relax, Eva, he grinned as it rose to a keening lament echoing in the damp chamber. It's just a recording of Amalia. Who's she? One of our greatest Fado singers. Music in the museum down here comes down here when someone opens a door in there, I think. What's she singing? A song of yearning for someone, saudade. As the singing paused, he looked frankly at her, the dark fleck showing in the white of his left eye, an injury from one of the accidents he'd told her about, perhaps. She turned away. She couldn't face it, the damage already done to each of them, the longing stretching between them as surely as time and distance. He took her 2 small black coffee tasted bitter and lukewarm. He poured 2 sachets of sugar into his, stirred it with a tiny teaspoon. She wanted it, something more between them to sweeten their solitary lives, but lacked the courage to share his poverty. So what do you do down here, Manuel, besides drinking coffee? I think, I dream. Without dreams in these hard times, you have no street to walk, nothing to follow. You lose your way. The singing resumed more resolutely. A song about fate. Fado means fate. The old Portuguese believed in fate. It goes well with Catholicism. Do you believe in it, Manuel? Sometimes, he smiled, after meeting you the first time at the markets. And when you lost a job during the Eurozone crisis, she asked quickly, hoping to cover her consternation. Yes, sometimes life forces us to take paths we don't choose. Is that how you justify selling those antique pieces to clients from other countries? Is that legal? Eva, you are naive, no? You have a job in a wealthy country. You have here your nice little overseas holiday. You can afford to pay to use the train station toilets. You can't afford shame if you have no money, Eva. Must piss in the gutter for everyone to see. Some of these pieces I sell are family heirlooms from unemployed Portuguese or Syrian refugees needing money. This black market is the only way some of us here can survive these days. Understand? So what you're doing is illegal. She couldn't keep the disapproval from her voice. Eva, in these years, my life is not a good life, but it is my life. In this moment, I have no choice. The fado singing stopped suddenly. Someone in the museum closed the door to our song, he smiled grimly. Maybe we wait in the darkness a long time, but the door and the song will open again one day. Thank you.